recorded, but Sheila needs to turn the camera on. There we go. All right, the session is being recorded. Thank you, Julie Westerlund, for being here to talk about how's the water. Go for it.
Oh,
You got
all
the
right.
floor.
Well, I think everybody here knows me, so we'll skip the formal introductions. I did a session, gosh, when was that? In spring or last fall? About spring. Yeah, I think it was spring, and there was how's the water, and that was more of a like, how are our lakes and rivers and streams doing? And if you were there, and this one, we're gonna talk specifically about drinking water. And so I will just like state right now, I'm not a drinking water expert. I'm a fisheries biologist. That's my actual area of expertise, but I hang out with a lot of people who know a lot about drinking water, and there are a couple of really great reports and strategic plans, action plans out there that I drew some good information from. And, I can give you resources if you really want to do a deep dive into this water topic. So there's a lot of great information out there. I tried to pull together some things that I thought would be relevant for you all. But, and so the discussion that I want to kind of have today is really kind of 5 main areas. First of all, where does our drinking water come from? Second of all, is it safe? Third, do we have enough? Fourth, what's happening to make sure that we have enough safe drinking water? And then what can I do? So if you have questions that don't fall into one of those buckets, bring them on right now and let me know. Think we'll be able to cover? We'll hit the high points anyway. Okay. But first we got to talk about why this is important. Why do we care? Okay, so we're worried there's not enough. Why else?
Goes into making coffee.
Because that's right. Things we love involve water, right? In many, many, many ways. And clean water is the most absolute fundamental basic human need, right? And I would suggest the most fundamental basic human right. And so one of the responsibilities that our government holds for us is to help ensure that we have safe drinking water. And so that happens at the federal level, at the state level, at the municipal level. And as we'll talk about, there's also some personal responsibility in there as well. So yeah, I mean, we are all made of water. We all rely on water every single day. We need water. And if it's not clean, that's a problem. And I think, the other thing I'll say about this topic, I'm going to talk pretty local today about what's happening here. Globally, the picture is not good. There are many people that don't have safe drinking water. And so, I just never want us to take that for granted that we have it available for us. It's a wonderful thing, and we need to be able to continue to support that. And, just keeping in mind all of those people that don't have the benefit of being able to rely on a source of safe drinking water. So where does our drinking water come from? Anyone?
Mississippi River.
Somebody said the Mississippi River.
Like Maple Grove has their own springs.
Maple Grove has their own springs. What else for us?
Aquifers?
Wells, groundwater, aquifers. The tap? A bottle? The sprinkler, right? So it comes from, like, we just turn the tap on and it comes out, right? I talked to the kids about this a few, a couple months ago, where I brought in my big jug of water and I said, like, where does it come from? Oh, like our kitchen faucet broke for a little while and we couldn't turn the tap on. And so, yeah, I mean, it comes out of your tap, but before that, it comes from nature, right? It comes from the sky and it comes from the ground. So, I just wanted to remind us that we have a water cycle, and water is actually a renewable resource from the perspective of the fact that we have the water cycle, which we have evaporation, we have condensation, and then the rain falls, it runs off. That's the point where we start to get concerned. Because if there's contaminants involved in the runoff, those contaminants can get either into our surface waters or our groundwater, which is really problematic. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but just a reminder that we have this water cycle. And our water does come to us in a couple of primary ways. One is surface water. So the Mississippi River is indeed a source of drinking water for some people that live in the Twin Cities. And then groundwater, that water tower is to signify groundwater, is another source of water. And so what that looks like, somebody said spring, someone said aquifer. Both of those are ways that water can be in the ground or come out of the ground. Obviously, once, so water exists underground in what some people might refer to as like an underground lake or river, but that's not it's not really accurate, because where water is, it's in pore spaces in between, rocks and sand and gravel. And if you have really solid bedrock, you're not going to have much water there. But if you have any other sort of underlying geology or rock like sandstone or something that is more of a what we call an unconfined layer, you're going to have, this is a representation of Southeast Minnesota, where we have limestone, which is very porous, and water can move through it very quickly. And where there's enough water that it kind of is aggregated in a space, that's called an aquifer, and we can pump out of that. And oftentimes those aquifers underground will be sort of self-contained, because there will be layers, different kinds of layers of rock that that I'm going to say confine an area that holds water underground in pore spaces in rocks. So there's always going to be rock or some kind of sediment, sand, whatever involved, but then the water travels through that, and depending on the different layers of geology, water might travel through very fast, or it might take a very, very, very long time to travel through. So when you hear aquifer, that could refer to a whole bunch of different things. It could be what we call a standpoint aquifer, which is a collection of water close to the water table, or it could be something where you've got to drill really far down into the rock to get, and through multiple different layers of rock to get to a space where you can actually pump the groundwater out, and that it's clean and it's safe. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. Anybody have a sense? Oh, and I'll just say one more thing. In terms of aquifers, groundwater, so the city of Maple Grove has a well that is drilled down into an aquifer, and they pump that out and they distribute it out to people. And then there are also, so that's called a municipal well. So there's lots of different kinds of what we call community water supplies. And then there's private wells. So a person, in fact, we have a house with a private well, Andy and I do. So we have our very own well, and there's a pipe that's drilled down into the ground that is probably about 120 feet down. And then we have a pump that pumps the water out, and that's where we get our water. So proportionally speaking, in Minnesota, just over half of people are getting their water from a community groundwater supply. So like what we just described for Maple Grove. About 25% of people are getting their water from a surface water system like the Mississippi River. And I'll talk a little bit more about the city of Minneapolis and their system. And then about 20% of people get their water from private wells.
So was this Minnesota?
This is Minnesota. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So are the private wells, are those, the numbers shrinking?
I don't know what the trend line looks like for numbers of wells.
I mean, because when we grew up in Crystal, we had a private well.
Mm-hmm.
And then the city came through.
Yeah.
Then you had, in order to sell your house, you had to
it would hook into the,
Well, you hooked it in,
community water
but
supply.
you had to make sure that that private well no longer would ever function.
yeah, and so we actually do have programs where we can, where you can get financial support to cap that well, because that's really important to make sure that nothing gets into the groundwater, because that well is unused and abandoned and open. So, but no, I don't really know. I mean, I suppose as cities continue to expand outward, there's going to be more of those community water supplies. It just kind of depends on where the development is happening, but yeah, generally speaking, if there's any concentration at all, and in fact, in our city where we've got a private well, we also have the opportunity to connect to the city's water supply, which is, you know, a lot of money. And so we've said for the time being, we're gonna keep our private well as opposed to paying to connect to the city's water supply. If our private well goes out, then we have to either drill a new one or then pay the money to connect to the city's, you know, so it's, sometimes you have a choice, which is kind of nice for us. Okay, so the, what happened to this slide? I don't know. I thought I had a picture in there. The city of Minneapolis takes this water from the Mississippi River, and then, right here in Golden Valley, oh, I got my slides mixed up, that's why. So hang on just a second. So this is the city of Minneapolis water treatment plant, up in Fridley. So it looks kind of like a prison or something, but it's just right up off the river on the east side of the river. And it's a huge facility where they take the water, comes right on the Mississippi River, and they run it through a series of forms of treatment. So first they put in a compound that basically causes all of the particulate matter in the water to clump up and settle out. And then, so it's called coagulation and flocculation. And then the sedimentation is that settling. And then they run it through a variety of filters, charcoal, carbon, sand, and then it gets disinfected, and it might also get treated, and it might get softened. Depending on, in Minneapolis, they soften the water and they do some additional treatment to prevent bacteria growth while it's being stored and sent out to individual homes. And so this is a generalized treatment process, and there might be, you know, slightly different steps along the way, but that's what it looks like for the city of Minneapolis. And then Minneapolis actually sells some of their water to this joint water commission, which is Maple Grove, Crystal, and New Hope. And they actually take the water and sell it out to the residents of these two cities. So your water comes here in Golden Valley, the water that's this water right here, and I just filled up my water bottle from the faucet over here, the water fountain. It comes out of Mississippi, goes through that treatment plant, goes into a reservoir that the city of Golden Valley owns and maintains, which uses about 28 million gallons every day. And then it comes here. So that's how we get our water right here at Valley Community Presbyterian Church. Questions about the surface water and that treatment?
I have the sense that we never run out. Let's go from outer space, because it just in the earth, it continues. We use it, and there it is again.
Well, if we're using the same water that the dinosaurs drank, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. It's also true that only 3% of the water on Earth is fresh water.
Yeah.
And even less than that is available to us to be able to like access and use. So, of course, the vast majority of the water is in the oceans. And then beyond that, a lot of it is far beneath the ground in aquifers and rock that, you know, we just can't get out, or it's frozen in the polar ice caps. And so the surface water and the surface water obviously has, you know, is subject to, we're subject to drought and water contamination. So it might not always keep coming. And the groundwater is clean. So this is private well. This looks kind of like the situation I have in my yard. It's not my yard, but, this water does not go through any treatment. It just gets pumped out of the ground and goes to my faucet or through the water heater, and I have a water conditioning system in my house that I pay for and manage and use. Because we have really like rusty water in where I live in the Southwest Metro. So if my well gets contaminated, that's a problem. I can fix, I can have it sanitized. Usually the contamination is gonna be like bacteria or something like that. But if it's got other contaminants in it, and we'll talk about what those are in a little bit. I have to deal with that, I have to manage that. And if contamination gets into the groundwater, it's a really big problem because it's hard to get out. And it's hard to clean and it's hard to take care of. So those are the threats. So yeah, there's a lot of water, but can we use it? Is the other question.
So how often do you test your water?
Well, so that's good.
If we're off.
We'll talk about that in a little bit, okay? Yeah. So not enough. Not enough is I'm feeling guilty because I just said to Andy last night, we should get our well tested. So I haven't done it. Okay, so is our water safe? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes, in Minneapolis, same.
Right? Yeah, your water is safe. But that doesn't mean that it's always safe and that there's nothing that could get into it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that my water is safe. I'm on a private well and I do need to make sure that it's safe. So there are lots of things that can get into our groundwater and that we need to be worried about and paying attention. Well, not worried about. Let me say it another way. That we need to be paying attention to, and that the people who manage our water systems spend a lot of time worrying about, so we don't have to. Okay, so some of the kinds of contaminants that we might find in our water include things that are like naturally occurring. So there are contaminants like manganese and arsenic, which can cause a lot of human health problems, but that are just, and radium is another one, they're just in the rock. And they're naturally occurring. Doesn't mean that they're, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's not gonna harm us. But they're just there. It's not because anybody polluted something. Microbial contaminants, that's some of the same things. You can have viruses, parasites. They're part of the ecosystem, part of the natural system. Or they could be the result of a concentration of contamination or a, leakage of wastewater or something like that. I talked about the radioactive ones already a little bit too. Those are kind of naturally occurring. Organic chemical compounds that, might be coming from industry or that kind of thing. And then the pesticides and herbicides obviously are a really big concern. And that would also, the organic one would also include things like nitrate, which is a really big problem. It's a fertilizer, but it also causes health problems for people, and it's causing a lot of problems in certain parts of the state. So if we, kind of think about all of the different ways that we use the land, all of those things have the potential to get into the water. And again, if you're on a municipal system, there's controls in place to safeguard and make sure that the water is treated and tested and that it's safe going out to the distribution system. If you're on a private well, it's a little bit of a different story. So you have to kind of know what's going on in your neighborhood and where your water comes from and be paying closer attention. Okay, so this is the city of Minneapolis's drinking water report. They were pleased to report that there were no violations of water quality standards in the year 2024. How many different parameters, or I call them constituents, the stuff that I just showed on the previous screen, how many different things do you think are tested for by the city of Minneapolis when they test the water?
All five. I mean, of those categories.
Oh, yeah. Within that, there's multiple.
Yeah.
Yeah. So give me a number. What do you think?
Like from, like 1 to 100 or
Mhm.
what are the variants? I think it's over 100.
It's around 100. So they test for around 100 different parameters, chemicals. Yeah, all kinds of different tests are happening. And then there are also periodic tests that don't, and that's like on a daily basis to make sure your water's safe.
They tested daily.
And then, yeah. And then there is, a large number of other tests that are being done. And so because those tests are required by the Safe Drinking Water Act, that's at the federal government level. And then there's also what we call contaminants of emerging concern that, there's millions of chemicals in our environment, right? And so we couldn't possibly test for all of them all of the time. But there are some that are, maybe more concerning than others. And so there will be special efforts to test certain things. And if, we didn't find something that was gonna cause a health concern, then we might not test it for a while. So, I'll just show you an example. This is a copy of all of those green checks mean that, the water is safe. So water does have some stuff in it. And no drinking water is ever going to be perfect, but what the government does is they use science to set what they call health risk limits. And they say, okay, you might have a little bit of arsenic in your water, but it's not enough to cause a health concern if you're exposed to it chronically. So, rarely you're gonna find that there's absolutely zero or non-detection of something, but oftentimes, most of the time, when something's detected, it's below that threshold of what is considered acceptable for human health. So just to make that distinction, that it's safe, it's not pure. You'd have to use reverse osmosis or a distilling system or something that would be far too expensive, but it is tested really regularly. Okay, and then this is the piece I was talking about before with public water systems. The public systems take care of the construction of the system, the routine testing. Mitigation is if there are contaminants, there's treatment that happens with that water to take the contaminants out. Protecting source waters, we'll talk about that in just a little bit here. And then, all of the funding associated with the well treatment and maintenance and construction and all of that, well sealing, that kind of stuff. For the most part, for private wells, you're kind of on your own. So, and then another thing to think about with the groundwater especially, and whether and how it might be contaminated, is how old is your water? So I talked earlier about the different layers of geology and how fast water might move through. So in systems where the pore spaces in the rock are really close together, the water might move through very slowly, and it could be thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years old. When that's the case, you might have more likelihood for those background natural contaminants like arsenic or manganese or radium, because the water's been sitting in the rock for so long. In situations where the water can move more fast through the rock because the pore spaces are larger, it can move more quickly and it can carry contamination with it, and it might be more likely to have human-caused contaminants. So considering the age of your water might be important. And so if you think about the young water being on top and the old water being on the bottom as it kind of flows through, and all of the different things that are happening in the aquifer. And now when you have pulling water out of the ground, that also creates differences in the way water flows underneath the ground as well. So it's a very complicated system. And because we can't see it, and it's really expensive to drill wells that can get deep enough into the ground to do that testing, There has to be really concerted efforts and a lot of coordination to make sure that all of the information is, that we need to manage the system is available, and it isn't always available. Sometimes there are things that we don't know. But in the Twin Cities metro area, we've got a really good handle on what's happening with the aquifers, the direction of flow of aquifers, the extent of contamination in certain places. And so it's in places where we maybe don't have as much data that we have some questions around, is there enough water and is it going to be safe for the long term? So let's talk a little bit about, is there enough water? Who thinks we have enough water? Jay thinks we have.
Well. Desalinization for the ocean water, we got plenty.
What is a potential challenge around desalinization?
What's what?
What's the challenge with desalination? That's your.
Why might that not be a great solution?
Distribute the water. to the
She's saying, why
inlet.
might that not be a good idea? That's,
Oh, it's not, it's,
he can't hear.
yeah, no, I, thank you, Sue, for being my interpreter.
Okay.
So there are places that's their water supply is desalinization. They take salt water and they take the salt out. And so that is really electricity intensive, and you've got a limit to how far you can distribute the water, right? So, but yeah, that's how people get their water in certain parts, arid parts of the world where, they don't have a lot of fresh water and they're close to the ocean.
What would those parts be?
Um,
Like a couple
think like Saudi Arabia,
of.
like that kind of,
Okay.
yeah, yep. Okay, so this is the cross section of the aquifers in the Twin Cities. So you can kind of see going west to east, there's Wright, Hennepin, Ramsey, Washington County. And we have multiple, this is what I was talking about earlier, I didn't do a great job explaining. The different sort of patterns represent different aquifers, and those are separated by these other layers of geology that might be like clay that water can't move through very easily. So keeping those separated is important because if contamination gets into one of these aquifers, we can keep that contained. So there are lots of rules about where you can drill a well and how deep it can be, and making sure that the aquifers are protected, because there's some natural protection already there because of these, what we call confining layers in the geology, that water doesn't pass through as easily. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Yeah. And so we actually have, the Prairie du Chien Jordan is, the one that, this one up here, sorry. That a lot of our water comes from, and then the Mount Simon Hinckley, which is the one on the very bottom, is pretty heavily regulated and, sort of like that's our fallback. That's where we don't want to take water out of there because that's our kind of long-term supply. And we want to make sure that that's getting sustainably managed. So, we have seen some declines in the aquifer levels because we consider sustainable use to be not using more than how much gets replenished every time it rains. So we talked about the water cycle, and that water, eventually soaks down into the ground. And as long as it's not contaminated, that's a viable system to keep relying on groundwater recharge to keep replenishing our aquifers. The problem comes when we start using more than what's going back in. And so that can either happen because we're using a lot, or because we're not getting very much water coming back in because we might be in a drought. So this past year, we've had all of that rain. The water managers are like, oh, good, we're getting groundwater aquifer recharge. We call it recharge when that aquifer gets filled back up. And we also have laws that say that if you're going to pull water out of the ground or from a surface water feature, you got to get a permit from the Department of Natural Resources. And they're the ones that maintain all of the information about who's using how much water and what's the level of our aquifers, and are they declining or are they increasing, and is one person's water use affecting someone else as well. So you can, if I have a well and I start using a lot of water, that's going to create almost like a vacuum underground, right? And more water is going to start flowing towards my well and maybe away from my neighbors. And especially if my neighbor has a shallower well, that can result in my neighbor's well going dry because I've used up all the water. And so the DNR makes sure, or at least does its best to avoid having that happen. And we do have places in Minnesota where there are conflicts around water use. And so the law lays out who gets to use the water first. So if you're going to irrigate your field and that's going to cause my domestic private well where I get my drinking water to go dry, you've got to stop irrigating. And so this is starting to set up some conflicts in places where irrigation is being relied on more because of drought, because of climate change. So it gets complicated. I'm not going to go through all the details, but there are thresholds by which you have to get a permit if you're using more water than 10,000 gallons a day or 1 million gallons a year. And we'll put that in perspective right now. So a 25-yard, 6-8 lane, however many lanes that is, swimming pool is about 150,000 gallons. So if you're using less than 1/10 of that swimming pool, you need a permit. In a day, you need a permit. Or if you're using 150 times what to make 1 million? Or maybe do math in public. Right. So 6 or 7 of those in a year, you need a permit from the DNR. So they're tracking and monitoring pretty carefully who's using water and how much. And then a water user, once I have a permit, I might not use 10,000 gallons every single day or 1 million gallons in a year, but I have to report back to the Department of Natural Resources how much water I actually did use. And it's a self-reporting system, but there are also ways of checking. And if, somebody suspects that their neighbor is using way more water than they are allowed, they can file a complaint with the DNR and get that looked at. So, but it sets people up for some pretty uncomfortable neighbor to neighbor interactions. But this is just a slide to remind. So this is the groundwater use, and this is all of the different categories, but not just drinking water. It's all the different ways that we use water in Minnesota. But the one I found most interesting is the green line for irrigation. So why do you think that's so up and down? It's the weather, right? Yeah. So the drier years are the years where we use a lot more water for irrigation. So what does the future bring for our water use? What do you think? Is there anything that you're concerned about or that you're hearing about that might be like
Places like the Southwest that don't have enough water, coveting places like Minnesota.
yeah?
They want our Great Lakes water. Yeah.
Yeah.
How are we gonna sell our Great Lakes water? I mean, in southern Minnesota, where there's so much farming, and that the quality of their water.
That's right. And especially Southwest Minnesota, they don't have good aquifers
Right.
because of the underlying soils. And so they've got to find other ways to get their water, and they pipe water from a long ways away sometimes. Not the Great Lakes per se. So far, the Great Lakes states and the provinces have a compact that, they've said we're not going to sell our water to others, but how long that can hold up under pressure is tough to, and it's already been sort of violated in, sort of nearby communities that are outside of the watershed of the Great Lakes. But some of these ideas about we're gonna have a water train that, pumps water out of the ground and sends it to or a big pipe or something, they're just logistically so.
Yeah.
Unlikely. On the other hand, we do have bottled water plants that are exporting our water all the time. And our water's getting exported all the time in the form of all of our agricultural products. If you think about it, that water is in our livestock and it's in our corn and it's in our, all of the products that we make. So, thinking about sending water, in its liquid form somewhere else and that it's expensive to do too. It's happening, but, and so you're not wrong that we should be concerned about people wanting our fresh water. And if you think about, climate refugees, where would you go? Where would you go if you were concerned about having an ample supply of fresh water? You would probably come to a place like Minnesota. So there actually are folks that are doing very long range planning to think about that. How do we make sure that our water supplies are protected, not just for us today here, but for what might happen down the line in the future. So one of the things that's coming to our attention, and it's been a big buzz in the circles that I run around in, is data centers.
Yes, oh, yeah.
Yeah. And these can be really big water users. So I said, you need a permit. If you're going to use 1 million gallons in a year, how much do you think one of these puppies can use? They use it for cooling. They use the water for
Do you
much.
recycle or constantly recycle?
Sometimes they're closed loop systems, but sometimes they're not. And I'm treading on the boundary of my knowledge of some of this stuff, Sue, but a statistic I read when I was researching this was they can use 200 million gallons of water in a year.
In a year, 200 million.
Yeah, so it's a lot. It's a concern. There's some other ones that we are kind of paying attention to. And the thing about all of these water users, so the other ones are hydrogen production plants, which was a kind of a new one to me, but that showed up in our recent water report here that I'll show you. Sustainable aviation fuel, if that really takes off, and ethanol also is a big water user. Carbon capture, utilization and storage also could affect our groundwater supplies. So those are things on the horizon that maybe we weren't thinking of even, 5 or 10 or 50 years ago when some of these laws and statutes were written. And so, we're trying to kind of keep up as folks that manage water. So that kind of leads us into like what is being done. So who is responsible for taking care of our water? Do you know? The water department.
Is it federal?
Well, it's at multiple layers.
Okay.
So good question. Yeah. So, at the federal level, the Safe Drinking Water Act is, I think, administered by the Environmental Protection Agency.
That's
And as well as the Clean Water Act. So those, are both put in place to safeguard our water and then there's state and local level activities. And actually I have a summary on a subsequent slide that shows you some of this, but the one I want to talk about the most is I work for the state of Minnesota. So that's kind of where I hang out and I know the most about what's going on. And so there's 5 main agencies at the state of Minnesota that really concern themselves a lot with water. And this slide depicts 4 of them. The 5th one is the Board of Water and Soil Resources where I work. But it's interesting because everybody's got kind of a unique role that's based on their agency's main mission. So the Department of Agriculture, they do monitoring for pesticides and fertilizer, and they regulate pesticides and fertilizer. So they're out there looking for where do we have excess of these things and how do we regulate those and make sure that they're staying out of our water enough. And trying to balance that with the economic viability of farming. So there's some realities associated with that situation. We can dive into that if you really want to. And I can answer questions. The Department of Health, they're the ones that are overseeing the public water supplies. So they require source water protection plans and drinking water supply management areas and all sorts of things. They also oversee construction of wells to make sure that the water that you're pulling out of that well is safe to drink and that the well is constructed properly in a way that doesn't contaminate the groundwater through the process of constructing the well. They also are responsible for setting those health risk assessment levels. So they will go through and do the science that says, you know, what concentration of what pollutants is a problem for people. And we, you know, we've got to watch out for exceedances of those. And then they do a lot of outreach and education on private wells because of those stuff I talked about earlier, that's, you know, you're really kind of on your own if you're a private well owner. The Pollution Control Agency, MPCA, they look at chemical releases at industrial sites where you might have contamination of water, and they do monitoring of those, and they also have permitting programs for that. And then, so those are all on the left side of the screen, sort of water quality concerns. And then the Department of Natural Resources is worried about how much water we have, the quantity. And part of the reason that's in the DNR's wheelhouse is their wellhouse, is because the amount of water is also, you know, it impacts ecosystems. So streams and rivers and water levels and that kind of thing. That's the domain of the DNR. So it gets really complicated. Like, who do I need to talk to about my water? Well, it depends. What is your concern? What are you worried about? Who's monitoring what? Who's regulating what? So those are some of our main tools, are the monitoring and then the regulation. And so this is the slide that summarizes all of the different regulatory programs. I don't expect you to read it, but at the top at the federal level, the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, and then at the state, there's lots of different programs and laws and statutory authorities and codes. There's the well code that talks about, you know, how does the well need to be constructed and maintained and sealed and that kind of thing. So all of these things are protecting us. And then there's also looking at the land and the water, because I talked about contamination earlier that comes from being on the land, right? So we have delineated areas that are called source water protection areas. And so this is a map showing can you see the light blue on there? That is the watershed, the area of land that drains to the Mississippi River. So if there were a spill anywhere in that area that could get to the Mississippi, and we actually can calculate the time of travel for water in any given spot, where if it's, you know, if there was a tanker that turned over and released a bunch of chemical, like how long would it take that to flow down to the Mississippi, and can we get it contained? And if not, what do we do? There's plans out there for that. And then the source water protection areas are the more immediate, like, boy, if something were to happen in this area, that's really a problem and we gotta be careful. So there's extra controls that are in place in those areas. So that's defined by how the water flows into the Mississippi River. So there's some extra things that are in place there. And then this is hot off the press from the Minnesota Department of Health. They've put together this drinking water action plan where they've set forth 5 kind of main categories of things that the state is doing or going to do to protect drinking water. And that's whether it's from surface water or groundwater. And so that's the source protection. Also thinking about water infrastructure. So who heard about what happened in Flint, Michigan?
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So that was because of lead pipes. We have lead pipes here too. And where there are lead pipes, there's an additive added to the water that prevents the corrosion of the lead from actually getting into the water itself. So that chemical additive is protective from lead contamination. And what happened in Flint was they said, "Now we don't need to put that stuff in the water anymore." And it caused the corrosion that caused the lead poisoning. So, but looking at that and trying to get those lead pipes replaced, so we don't need to do that extra step. And we don't, you know, put people at risk in that way. And then just recognizing overall that our water infrastructure, all of our pipes and pumps and, you know, ways that we treat are getting old. And so we need to continue to invest in those, because if something breaks, then we can't turn on our tap and get clean water in. And in fact, was anybody affected by, there was a boil water advisory? Yeah.
Sudden, phones got beep, 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 you know?
So what happened was, there was a breakdown in the communication from one computer system to another between Golden Valley system and the Minneapolis system. And the concern was that there was a drop in water pressure, which would allow contamination potentially to flow in. Because if you keep pressure up all the time, that's kind of pushing out and it's preventing anything from coming in. But if the pressure drops, then that creates kind of a vacuum, and, you know, whatever might be able to get into the system. And there actually was never really a problem, but they did that precautionary boil water because they had to go in and put in additional tests for the water that tested for things like bacteria, which take a while to culture and, get the test back and stuff. So that was what happened with that boil water advisory.
Is that why water towers are tall? Pressure?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because that's all pressure, mostly pressure fed. When you turn the water on in your tap, it's just the water comes out because of water pressure that's established by that water tower.
But it also keeps out contaminants.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Ensure safe tap water, we've already talked about that. Anticipate and manage emerging risks, we've talked about that a little bit too. And then partner engagement. And then this I thought was a pretty nice kind of summary of the two different main water sources, surface water on the top. It gets treated, it gets stored. And what they're pointing out with these boxes that have the triangles with the exclamation points in them are the places where there might be some risks that we're trying to pay attention to and anticipate and, sort of head off. Contaminants, we've talked about a lot. Geogenic is a fancy word that means the arsenic and the manganese and the things that are sort of exist in the rock that can get into our water and cause problems, but are not human made. Climate change is another risk. I've talked about the aging pipes and systems, also a shrinking workforce. We have a lot of really high people that work at water treatment plants are highly trained, and they're actually having trouble getting people to sign up to go work at water treatment plants. So it's a 2-year degree that you can go and get and become a water treatment plant operator. And then data systems as well. So we constantly are thinking about how we upgrade the information that we have available. And then, for public water supplies, sometimes that aging infrastructure, replacing that comes at a really high cost that the community can't afford to pay. So the state has a revolving loan program so that a community can get a low interest loan from the state of Minnesota. But you got to get on a list in order to do that. It's not just coming to you automatically. And then for private wells, there's that burden of responsibility and not necessarily money to do it. So, and then again, we're doing a lot of monitoring and testing and water supply planning, which, there's all sorts of facets about water supplies that we're trying to think about. So I'm not going to go through all of that, but just suffice it to say that, there's a lot of things going on, especially at the state level, where there are folks that are really working hard and in all of our interests to make sure that we continue to have a safe and abundant supply of drinking water. Okay, so let's wrap up with what you can do. Any ideas right out of the gate?
Use less. What'd you say? Use less. Use less.
Yeah.
Conserve.
Yes. That's one.
You mean turn off the faucet when I'm brushing my teeth?
You should. So, my husband, I'm gonna preemptively, he might say she doesn't always turn off the water when she's brushing her teeth. Sometimes I've been accused of I'll turn it off when I start, and then it's like, okay, I'm almost done. We'll turn it back on, and it's like, oh, I'm not really done yet. So, and I do enjoy me a long shower every once in a while. So, none of us are gonna be perfect. And some of it is thinking about which are small impacts
Yes.
that we're gonna beat ourselves up over and which are really big impacts that, might just doing a certain thing one time can undo all of the turning off the water when we brushed our teeth for a whole year.
Yeah, right.
So that's, I think that's something to consider. Go ahead, Janet.
Well, as a gardener, I have moved toward native plants that are more adaptable
That's
to our climate. And I only have one potted plant, which I cannot give up, and I have to water that.
No one's asking you to give up your potted plant, Janet.
But, we'll plant all annuals that need to be watered every day, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a balance. I mean, we have vegetable gardens and we have native plant gardens and we have annuals and we have pots, we have stuff everywhere. And yeah, some of that does have to be watered and it's okay. Yeah. Okay, well, one of the things you can do is like what you're doing right now, learning a little bit more. You can go to the city of Minneapolis and download their report if you want to see it, or even to Golden Valley and see exactly what's in your water and what's going on. And talk to other people, especially like you don't need to have a treatment system for your water if you get your water from the city. You can if you don't like the taste. I mean, some people want to put a filter on just because they, don't like how it tastes, but there's a problem in that, and I was gonna call up the research on this, but I heard about it last year. There's some social science work that's being done. And what they're finding is that communities of color especially do not trust their drinking water. They don't trust that they can turn the tap on and that the water is going to be safe for them to drink. So they're spending unnecessary amounts of money on bottled water. And so, anything we can do to spread the word that your water actually is safe to drink if you're getting it, outside. And it's very likely safe to drink if you're getting it from a private well too, but you should verify that and have it tested. Did you have a question, Mary?
Yeah, I wondered if there's some reason these folks don't trust their water.
I don't remember exactly what they found was, I think there's some cultural things that, maybe they've got family or friends that are in other areas where it's not safe to drink, or there's a, sort of lack of trust.
We live in Flint.
Yeah, great, exactly. Yeah, you hear a story about a place like Flint and,
Yeah.
or just lack of access to information, yeah. So, and then just, here's another thing to know is, you can actually go online and find out if you have a lead service line that's coming to your house.
Huh.
And then, there's actually like a legally defined dividing line where the line that's coming in from the city belongs to them. And, once it crosses a certain point by the curb, then that line belongs to you and it's your responsibility to maintain. And so if a tree root grows in there, you're the one calling the Roto-Rooter guy. It's not the city's responsibility to do. And then this is the list of things that should be tested in your private well, Andy Westerlund. We need to go and do that. And it's, kind of gives you a sense of how often. So you can see the last three are those geogenic contaminants that we, they're either in the water or they're not. I mean, unless something's changed dramatically with the water in your area, probably not a reason to keep testing for those. And I'm not so worried about nitrate. The concern about nitrate is especially in agricultural areas where there's a lot of ag and there's porous soils, that nitrate can move through very quickly. So that's happening in the southeast part of the state right now. So those folks really do need to get their wells tested, and some of them cannot drink their own water, and it's not their fault. And so, we're trying to talk at the state about how do we support them and help them.
So do you have to send your water to be tested or can you do it yourself or?
Question. The Department of Health.
Because I just think that's fascinating.
Right, no, the Department of Health actually maintains a list of people. Again, I don't expect you to be able to read it, but they've got a map and they have a list of accredited labs where you can call them up and say, how do I get you a water sample from my tap so that you can test my well water? And they will give you instructions for what to do next.
Okay.
And so and part of it is like, you gotta let your water run for 5 minutes, which is like, I don't wanna let my water run for 5 minutes, but before, because they want, sort of whatever's been sitting in your pipes to kind of clear out and get the actual water from your well. So they will give you the instructions and and the list kind of talks about what things do each lab test. So if you want all of those 5 items tested.
Take a long time.
Go ahead and do that.
How often does it take a week, a month?
Oh, probably less than a week.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
that's good.
I don't think it takes that
That's
long.
good to know.
Yeah. And then if you do own a private well, you might consider an under the sink water filter or some other sort of water treatment system. We have one of these. It's called Aquasana, and the filters are super easy to replace and maintain. And I like my drinking water a lot better that way. It was fine before, it just tasted kind of, and it does have a little arsenic in it, but not enough to trip that, the
Poisoning.
health risk limit. So, jargon, I'm sorry. But, just a little more of a peace of mind too. So, and then, there's other stuff we can do in terms of water conservation. So get a low flow fixtures. You can make sure you're fixing any leaks and drips because they add up really quickly. Get high efficiency appliances, do full loads when you wash your dishes and your laundry. And then, the irrigation of your lawn. And, and it is interesting because it's been so rainy all summer and our lawn is beautiful. And, we were just talking about it, like, boy, it'd be nice if, but if next year it's really dry, it's just gonna be a brown crispy, because we don't water our lawn. But it sure looks nice when you do. So, it's tricky. And you can see, if you look at annual graphs of water use, you can absolutely see the seasonal spikes that correspond to people feeding their drug dependent rug, as we like to call them. So, yeah, and then just some other ways. These are infographics that we don't need to spend a lot of time going through because you guys know all of this stuff already. So yeah, I think this is a topic that we could talk a lot more and longer about, but it's obviously super important. And then the thing I left off the slide is, or off the previous slides is, sort of that advocacy work and supporting investments in maintaining our infrastructure, supporting political candidates that are going to do the right thing in terms of taking care of our collective shared resource of water. It belongs to everybody and we all deserve to have clean, safe water, and that, requires a certain level of government involvement and prevention as well as investment. So, removing a lot of the elements of the Clean Water Act is really concerning. And, eliminating a bunch of the waters of the United States that actually are subject to the Clean Water Act is really concerning because everything actually is connected. And so I'm not going to say a whole lot more about that. So anyway, other thoughts, questions? Is this helpful?
Well, that's great.
Thank you.
That's great. You changed your attitude, Jane? Is there enough water?
Get the dinosaur.
Okay,
It's dinosaur pee, Jay.
It's been filtered.
Yes, it's been very well filtered.
It's been a discussion.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?